On the Eastern DRC, I would just challenge that the UK hasn't spoken about it. There's been quite a few statements. If you look on Twitter, for example, our ministers Andrew Mitchell and Lord Ahmed have both made comments about the situation there recently. Most specifically, last week or the week before, Lord Ahmed talked about a recent attack in Kisheshe, which seems to have led to the killing and rape of a number of individuals in Eastern Congo, which is extremely distressing. I think what we are very clear about is that the humanitarian suffering has to stop. And for that to stop, all sides need to implement what has been agreed in places like Rwanda and in the Nairobi process. And the things that have been agreed, which we think must be implemented, are first, that the fighting has to stop. All armed groups need to stop fighting and respect the ceasefire. That also includes the FARDC forces. There should be no support to illegal armed groups. And there should be withdrawal, as has been agreed. So some organizations, such as the M23, who themselves have publicly said that they will both cease fire and withdraw, those things need to be implemented. We are not yet seeing that implementation, and so we are clear that it needs to happen. But we're also clear that there needs to be more action from the government of the DRC to tackle hate speech in the region, which I know is very concerning to many communities there. And it also has to tackle any collaboration between its armed forces and armed groups such as the FDLR. But there really will not be a military solution to this. So our strong opinion is that this needs to be a political process, both between the countries of the region, but importantly between the government in Kinshasa and the various rebel groups that exist in its territory. And the Nairobi process is designed to deliver that. So we're very grateful to the government of Kenya, particularly for its leadership on this issue, and to the entire East African community for helping to facilitate these talks. But we really need to see all sides deliver on their commitments. And then we will also hope to see the East African force that has been agreed come onto the ground to then provide the sort of buffer and protection for civilians to stop the fighting. But really, this has to be a political process, and that's what we're pressing for. Yes, I mean, I think we already have the framework in terms of what's set out and what's been agreed in Luanda and Nairobi. The problem is it's not being implemented by any side, really, let's be honest. So I think what we see is our conversations, and we're having a lot of conversations with the government in DRC, with governments across the EAC and here in Kigali, to look at how do you ensure that we really deliver on those things. And I think those sort of conversations that we have privately are productive and beneficial, but we need to see the action being taken. And I do think that we need to have the EAC in the lead on this process, because the ones who know this region best is the region itself, the ones who can help contribute to the solution. And we, as the UK, as other international partners, can support that. We announced some funding just recently when the Foreign Secretary was in Nairobi to support the Nairobi process, to allow the government of DRC to have these negotiations with its own rebel groups. Because you're right that in the end, negotiating with rebel groups in its territory is primarily a responsibility for the government of the DRC, and it needs to do that. But for that to happen, then all support for rebel groups needs to stop, that there needs to be a ceasefire, because it's very difficult for any government to have conversations with rebel groups while fighting is ongoing. So I think if we can see that ceasefire that's already been committed to implemented as the first step, it then opens the way for more political dialogue, and that's what we're pressing all parties to do. On the DRC, I mean, you started by saying that you're very worried about the DRC, and I think I can safely tell you that I share that worry, that the government of the UK, and I know many in the region and international community share that worry, because there are very many bad things going on in the Eastern DRC. And it's not only in one direction. There are armed groups that are, causing suffering of civilians. There has been reports of sexual violence against civilians, which is extremely distressing. And there is, as you have talked about, a real rise in hate speech in Congo, and a lot of it targeting Kinyarwanda-speaking communities. And that is also extremely worrying and something that needs to be tackled, which is a point that we have made repeatedly to the government in the DRC. But the solution to this really has to be about first ensuring that there is a ceasefire and that armed groups are no longer fighting, because it is very difficult to try and have any kind of political discussion, political solution, while fighting continues on the ground. And then another part of it that I think will be important in providing protection for civilians is we already have MONUSCO, which is doing some of that, but bringing in the East African force that has been agreed to also provide some of that protection for people. And I fully agree with you that we are talking about here communities that are Congolese. These are, whatever language they speak, they are Congolese, they live in Congo, and they need to be dealt with as citizens, as any government would deal with citizens. But the answer to any of these problems is not violence. The answer to any of these problems is not rebel groups fighting and causing suffering to civilians. And we have seen recent UN reporting which has said that the M23 has carried out some attacks recently that also need to be fully investigated. And we condemn any of these attacks on civilians just as we condemn hate speech. But I think it's going to require all parties working together. And this is why I think that the EAC is a useful framework to bring these parties together. Because, you know, we're talking about the M23 a lot these days, but as you alluded to, and as we know, there are many, many other armed groups in Eastern Congo. And I haven't been engaged in the area as long as you have, but I was working on this region back in 2012 when we saw a similar real spike in violence. And I think, you know, that is not good for anybody. And we know that there are other armed groups like the ADF, there are armed groups, you know, rebels from Burundi and so on. And we cannot have a situation where there is this lawless situation in Eastern Congo that is causing suffering, that is damaging the economy of the whole region. Because, you know, if you could find a point where there is peace, there is stability, there is a return to greater trade, there is enormous benefit for all the countries of the region, particularly for Rwanda with a big market on the eastern border, but on the western border of Rwanda, but also for other countries in the region. And it's in all our interests, I think, to try and find stability and peace in this area, certainly for the people of Congo. But I think it does really take all sides working towards that and trying to get away from simply blaming one group or another, the other side, but really looking at what do we need to do now to bring peace. And for me, the first step of that is a ceasefire, is living up to the things that have been agreed in Rwanda, and then moving to a political process.